So, in the last lecture, I tried to make clear all the costs in terms of happiness that we're going to see when we punish criminals, right? By its very nature, punishment is going to make criminals unhappy. It's going to cost money we could spend elsewhere to create happiness on other things. Public school teachers, free tuition at colleges, better roads, even more cops, right? You could spend this money in other ways. Well, and it could create happiness. It's going to have huge effects on the families of people who are incarcerated, right? On down the line. Well, why do we do it? Well, the main point of criminal punishment for a utilitarian, just to lay my hand down, is going to be deterrence. Crime, by its very nature, creates unhappiness, you know, and if we punish it, we'll prevent it, right? If someone smashes the window of your car and steals the stuff in your car, that's going to make you unhappy. If someone assaults you, that's definitely going to make you unhappy. If someone kills someone you love, well, it'll deprive that person of happiness. It'll deprive all of their friends and family of happiness. And imagine if we didn't punish murderers, right? What do you think's going to happen to the murder rate? Yeah, it's going to be terrible, right? So the utilitarian will say, some things, crimes create a lot of unhappiness. By punishing them, we will deter them. And this deterrence has two forms. One is just that when someone is in jail, their opportunity to commit crimes is much lower. And there are a lot of people you can't commit crimes on, right? If you're a financial fraudster like Bernie Madoff or Sam Bankman-Fried, well, you're not going to be committing financial fraud when you're in prison, right? And, we also, when someone else is thinking of pulling a Madoff or a Bankman-Fried, or smashing someone's window, or selling drugs on the corner, or whatever, they will know that other people have went to jail and that we send people to jail for this. And a lot of people who might otherwise do these things, knowing there's a punishment, won't do it. Now, there's other ways that punishment might create some happiness. The family or the person who's been wronged by the criminal, they might get some happiness out of seeing the criminal punished. We as a society tend to like to see criminals punished. And, those will factor in for the utilitarian, but they're honestly not big enough to really justify the practice, and they're not really the main point. For a utilitarian, these might be like the cherry on top of the sundae or gravy, right? It's not the main thing. All right. So if deterrence is our main concern, this will help us to answer the second question. How do we determine punishments? To approach this from another direction, why does it make sense to punish some crimes more lightly and some more severely? Why are we going to treat a murderer, worse, give him a longer sentence than we do a shoplifter? And why are we going to put the person who assaults somebody or carjacks somebody in between, right? Why do we do this? Well, the utilitarian has an account, but we have to step back and think about it a little bit. There's a fair amount going on here. And the first thing we need to think about, to have in mind, is this concept of diminishing returns. Now, if you guys have taken an economics class, you might have heard of this. It's a very simple, but I think important idea, which is that in just about any area of life, after a certain point, more of X will get you less of Y. Okay, that probably strikes you guys as very abstract. What in the world does that mean? I mean, think about it this way. Let's imagine you want to go out for lunch. If you have no money in your pocket and nobody will lend you any money, well, you just can't do that, right? Now imagine you have $10. Well, now you can actually afford to get lunch somewhere. The difference between $0 and $10 is huge, right? Well, what if you had 20? Well, if you have 10, you could probably go to McDonald's or Wendy's or somewhere. 20 might get you a slightly nicer lunch. Maybe even get a drink with it. What about 30? You know, the difference between $0 and 10 is not as great as the difference between 10 and 20, and the difference between 20 and 30 is not as great as the difference between 10 and 20, right? For 10, you're going to be limited to pretty much fast food. For 20, a lot more options are going to open up. Now think about, if you wanted a really fancy dinner, if you had $100 that would do it. What's the difference between a $100 meal and a $110 meal? Probably very little, right? And for most of us, after a certain point, there wouldn't be any real difference. You know, I mean, if you gave me $150 to just blow on dinner, and I have to blow it on dinner, I could probably do that. But I'm not sure that I would actually notice any difference between that and somebody giving me 125, right? I don't know. Maybe somebody who's, more of a gourmet or whatever would, but it rapidly reaches a point where more money makes very little difference. And you can see this in other areas, right? I remember I had a friend years ago. He had been an athlete in high school and college, and he had continued to eat like, I think he'd been a linebacker actually. He continued to eat like a linebacker even though he wasn't, you know, really doing any physical activity, and he'd put on a lot of weight, right? And what he told me is like he found like 20, 30 minutes a day to exercise, and he started to make some, fairly modest changes in his diet. You know, fried chicken twice a week instead of 5 days a week, mashed potatoes for half a meal, not every meal, right? I don't know what this guy did, right? But I mean, he was a really good cook too, which probably hurts. I remember eating fried chicken he made, and it was great. But he made some fairly minor changes. And he was a pretty big guy. He lost like 30 pounds in the space of a few months. But then he said, it was pretty easy to lose the first 30 pounds. Losing the next 5 was hard. And after that, every pound was a battle, right? It very quickly gets to the point where more exercise, more dieting, more whatever, every pound takes more effort to take off than the last. Diminishing returns. The sort of increase in activity and decrease in the amount of food that he ate that would get this guy to lose 30 pounds. Well, now we'll only take off 5, right? And after that, maybe it only takes off 1. More effort, more of X gets you less of Y. Well, why do I talk about this so much here? Well, because it applies to punishment. With criminal punishment, criminologists will tell you, I mean, I'm not a criminologist, but just in the research I've done, they'll tell you that just making something illegal and having any kind of punishment for it does a lot to deter people. Just making it illegal and giving it even the shortest of sentences, like a weekend in jail or whatever, will deter a lot of people who otherwise might do the thing. But after that, more and more punishment rapidly gets you less deterrence, right? And I mean, think of it this way. If you were the kind of person who wanted to shoplift from a store and a weekend in jail didn't deter you, well, 3 days in jail probably wouldn't, right? Even though, look, we've increased the punishment by a whole lot, right? That's a 50% increase. Or, if you wanted to beat somebody up and you're not deterred by 6 months in jail or whatever, well, would a year deter you, right? more punishment very quickly runs into diminishing returns. And that's a problem because we're still paying as a society, we're still paying the same for each additional amount of punishment, right? If we suddenly change the punishment for some crime from 2 years in jail to 3, well, that's another $61,000 we have to pay in Virginia, or $63,000 national average, right? And you very quickly run into a point where not only do you get less and less deterrence, but it's not worth it. You know, if you could have shoplifting by just sentencing people to jail for a weekend, we would probably all be for that. It's annoying for stores. The costs are passed on, at least in some degree, to the rest of us, right? But, if I told you, look, we could cut shoplifting another 25% by sending shoplifters to jail for 10 years, you'd be like, well, that's outrageous, right? Look, what's the cost of that 25% of shoplifting? It's way less than hundreds of thousands of dollars to incarcerate these people, or the miseries it causes their family. My point here is where that point where more deterrence isn't worth it depends on the crime. You really quickly hit that point with something like shoplifting. You hit it a little later for something like smashing the windows of people's cars and stealing stuff out of it, right? You hit it later because breaking into someone's car or home causes more unhappiness. You hit it later for people who assault other people, right? Or commit violent robberies. Because people are actually hurt, there's psychological trauma, they cause more unhappiness. You hit it even later for something like murder, right? So the amount of deterrence you get for more punishment keeps going down, but whether the extra deterrence is worth it will depend on the crime. For shoplifting, we hit the point where extra deterrence isn't worth it very quickly. For other forms of theft later, for violent crime later, for murder even later, right? That is the general utilitarian framework. Now, in the next lecture or two, I want to get more specific and ask, well, how are we doing as a society in hitting that sweet spot, right? Where we are paying just enough that the deterrence we get is worth it and we're not wasting resources and causing unnecessary unhappiness. I'm going to focus on drug crimes because the whole issue of criminal justice in the U.S. is just huge. Couldn't take it on if I had like a couple semesters, but I think drugs are an interesting one. So we'll kind of focus on that one in thinking about how are we doing in America from a utilitarian perspective.